Picture this. You're hanging naked in the blazing Mediterranean sun, every breath a struggle that sends fire through your lungs, while crowds of strangers mock your agony for entertainment. Your wrists and feet are pierced with iron spikes, your shoulders dislocated from supporting your body weight, and you know with absolute certainty that death won't come quickly. Welcome to Roman crucifixion, the most sadistically designed execution method in human history. You think you know what crucifixion looked like because of sanitized religious art and Hollywood movies? But the reality was so much worse than any textbook dares to tell you. Those peaceful, dignified images you've seen, complete fiction. The Romans didn't just kill people on crosses. They orchestrated elaborate torture spectacles designed to inflict maximum suffering while keeping victims alive for as long as possible. Here's what they don't teach you in history class. Crucifixion wasn't just about nailing someone to wood and waiting for them to die. This was psychological warfare disguised as justice, a carefully choreographed horror show that began days before the actual execution and continued long after the victim's final breath. The Romans had turned murder into performance art, complete with cheering audiences and vendors selling snacks to spectators who came to watch human beings die in the most excruciating way imaginable. Modern medical experts who've studied the process describe it as arguably the most painful death a human being can endure. We're talking about a method so brutal that the word excruciating literally comes from the Latin ex cruciare, meaning out of the cross. The Romans invented an entirely new word just to describe this level of agony because existing language couldn't capture the horror. But here's where it gets truly insane. The crucifixion you see in movies, where someone dies peacefully within hours, was considered a mercy killing by Roman standards. Real crucifixions lasted days. Victims would hang there, fully conscious, as their bodies slowly shut down while crowds gathered below to place bets on how long they'd survive. Guards would break their legs to speed up death, only as an act of unusual compassion. The worst part? This wasn't reserved for the worst criminals. The Romans crucified anyone who challenged their authority. Runaway slaves, political dissidents, common thieves, even entire populations when they wanted to send a message. Historical records describe roads lined with thousands of crucifixes, turning major highways into galleries of human suffering that stretched for miles. Palace records show that Romans crucified an estimated 6,000 slaves along the Appian Way after the Spartacus rebellion, a 120-mile stretch of rotting corpses meant to remind everyone exactly what happened when you defied Rome. Imagine driving past that nightmare for weeks as the bodies decomposed in the sun. What made Roman crucifixion truly diabolical wasn't just the physical torture, though that was horrifying enough to make grown men lose their minds before they died. It was the complete destruction of human dignity. Victims were stripped naked, mocked by crowds, and left exposed for days as their bodies failed in the most humiliating ways possible. The Romans had weaponized shame itself, turning death into public entertainment that left psychological scars on entire communities. If you think medieval torture was bad, buckle up. What the Romans did with crucifixion makes Game of Thrones look like a children's fairy tale, and by the time we're done here, you'll understand why this execution method was so effective that it helped maintain an empire for centuries through sheer terror alone. Picture this. You're walking through the bustling streets of ancient Rome when suddenly the crowd falls silent. Everyone's eyes turn toward the city gates, where dozens of wooden crosses stretch along the roadside like a grotesque forest. Bodies hang from each one, some still writhing in agony, others motionless after days of exposure. The stench of death mingles with the sounds of labored breathing and occasional screams. Welcome to Roman justice, where crucifixion wasn't just an execution method. It was theater designed to break your spirit before you even thought about rebellion. The Romans didn't invent crucifixion, but they perfected it into an art form of terror. While other civilizations used it occasionally, Rome transformed this brutal practice into the backbone of their control system. We're talking about an empire that needed to keep millions of conquered peoples in line, and nothing said, "Don't mess with us," quite like the sight of your neighbors dying slowly on wooden crosses for days on end. Here's what made Roman crucifixion so psychologically devastating. It was completely public. These weren't hidden executions carried out in dark dungeons. Romans deliberately placed crosses along major roads, especially outside city gates where maximum foot traffic guaranteed maximum witnesses. The famous Appian Way, Rome's premier highway, became a corridor of horror in 71 BCE when over 6,000 followers of Spartacus were crucified along its length. Imagine traveling that road, 120 miles of rotting corpses stretching from Rome to Capua, a permanent reminder of what happened to those who dared challenge Roman authority. But here's where it gets truly calculated. Romans specifically reserved crucifixion for slaves, foreigners, and the lowest classes of society. This wasn't accidental. Roman citizens, no matter their crime, were typically granted the mercy of beheading, quick, clean, dignified. Crucifixion was designed to be the ultimate humiliation, a death so degrading that it stripped away every shred of human dignity. The victim was usually naked, exposed to public mockery, unable to control basic bodily functions, becoming a spectacle of human degradation. The timing was equally brutal. Unlike other execution methods that offered quick death, crucifixion could drag on for days. Romans understood that a quick death might create martyrs, but watching someone slowly deteriorate into a broken shell of humanity, that broke people's spirits. Families were often forced to watch their loved ones die slowly, unable to help, creating trauma that rippled through entire communities. Roman governors wielded crucifixion like a weapon of mass psychological destruction. When Pontius Pilate wanted to remind Jerusalem's population who was really in charge, he didn't just execute individual troublemakers, he lined the roads with crosses. When rebellious provinces needed pacification, mass crucifixions became Rome's calling card. Historical accounts describe hundreds of crosses erected simultaneously, transforming entire landscapes into monuments to Roman power. The crowds who gathered weren't just morbid spectators, they were unwilling participants in Rome's theater of control. Parents brought children to witness these executions, not out of cruelty, but because Roman society expected citizens to understand the consequences of defying authority. These public deaths served as community education, each crucifixion a lesson in submission taught through human suffering. What made this system particularly insidious was its efficiency. One crucifixion could terrorize thousands of witnesses, each of whom would carry that image home to their families, spreading fear through word of mouth across entire regions. Rome discovered that the anticipation of crucifixion was almost as powerful as the act itself. Just the threat of ending up on those crosses kept potential rebels in line. The Romans didn't just nail people to crosses and call it a day. They turned execution into a calculated symphony of suffering that began long before the victim ever saw wood. What happened before the crucifixion was designed to break both body and spirit in the most methodical way possible. It started with the flagellation. Picture being stripped naked in front of a jeering crowd, then tied to a post with your back exposed. Roman soldiers would use a flagrum, a multi-tailed whip embedded with pieces of bone, metal, and pottery shards. This wasn't a simple whipping. Each strike tore through skin, muscle, and sometimes reached all the way to bone. The typical flogging involved 39 lashes, enough to leave victims looking like raw meat. Many didn't survive this preliminary torture, which tells you everything about what came next. Those who survived the flogging faced the humiliation ritual. Soldiers would force a purple robe over their mangled backs and press a crown of thorns deep into their scalp. The thorns weren't decorative. They were long enough to puncture skull bone and cause severe bleeding. Victims were mocked, spat upon, and beaten with rods before being forced to carry their own crossbeam through the streets. Here's where it gets truly methodical. The crossbeam, called a patibulum, weighed between 75 to 125 pounds. Imagine carrying that weight on shoulders already shredded from flogging, stumbling through crowds who came specifically to watch you suffer. The Romans made this walk as long as possible, forcing victims to parade through busy market areas where maximum humiliation was guaranteed. At the execution site, the real horror began. Contrary to popular belief, victims weren't gently laid on crosses. They were thrown onto the ground where soldiers would stretch their arms across the crossbeam. The nails weren't driven through palms. That's a myth. Romans knew palm flesh would tear under body weight. Instead, they drove 7-inch iron spikes through the wrists, right between the radius and ulnar bones, often severing the median nerve and causing immediate, excruciating pain that shot up the entire arm. The positioning was deliberately calculated. Victims were nailed with arms slightly above shoulder height, forcing them into an unnatural position that made breathing increasingly difficult. The feet were then nailed to the vertical post, sometimes with a single nail through both feet, other times with separate nails. Romans would bend the knees slightly and turn the feet sideways to ensure the nails hit bone and held firm. But here's the most brutal detail. Executioners were trained specialists. These weren't random soldiers assigned crucifixion duty. They knew exactly where to drive nails for maximum pain, while ensuring the victim wouldn't bleed out quickly. They understood human anatomy well enough to guarantee a slow death that could last days. The cross was then raised using ropes and pulleys, with the victim's full weight suddenly slamming down onto the nail points. The jar of being lifted sent shockwaves of pain through every wound. Romans would dig a socket in the ground, specifically sized for each cross, ensuring it would drop into place with maximum impact. Once vertical, the real suffering began. But the Romans had one more psychological torture. They posted guards specifically to prevent any rescue attempts and to ensure the victim remained conscious as long as possible. They'd even offer drugged wine to keep victims alert, not to ease their pain, but to prolong their awareness of every agonizing moment. This wasn't execution. This was performance art, designed to terrorize entire populations into submission. Your lungs are screaming for air, but every breath requires pulling your entire body weight up against iron nails driven through your wrists. This wasn't just execution. This was engineered torture, designed to turn the simple act of breathing into an agonizing choice between suffocation and searing pain. Here's what actually happened to your body on a Roman cross. The moment they hoisted you up, your arms stretched above your head, your diaphragm compressed, and your lungs partially collapsed. In this position, exhaling comes naturally, but inhaling becomes nearly impossible. To draw breath, you'd have to push up on the nail through your feet and pull with your arms, lifting your chest just enough to expand your lungs. Every single breath meant driving those iron spikes deeper into mangled flesh and bone. Modern medical experts who've studied crucifixion mechanics discovered something truly horrifying. Victims didn't die from blood loss like you might expect. They died from what's called positional asphyxia, essentially drowning in their own body fluids while conscious and alert. Your lungs would gradually fill with fluid as you desperately alternated between hanging limp and pushing yourself up to breathe. Each cycle became more exhausting than the last, but wait. It gets worse. Those nails weren't driven through your palms like Hollywood shows you. Romans knew anatomy. They hammered them through your wrists, right between the radius and ulnar bones, often severing the median nerve. Imagine the worst nerve pain you've ever experienced, then multiply it by 1,000 and make it constant. Victims would feel lightning bolts of agony shooting up their arms with every tiny movement. The nail through your feet created its own special hell. Driven through the top of both feet simultaneously, it often shattered the small bones and pressed against major nerves. Standing on that nail to breathe meant putting your full weight on shattered bone fragments, grinding against raw nerve endings. Your body would betray you in other ways too. Dehydration set in quickly under the Mediterranean sun. Your tongue would swell. Your lips crack and bleed, your vision blur. Muscle cramps would seize your arms and legs as you hung there, adding waves of fresh agony to the constant baseline of torture. Insects would swarm around your wounds, and there was absolutely nothing you could do to stop them. The cruelest part? This ordeal could last for days. Romans specifically designed crucifixion to be slow. They'd sometimes attach a small wooden peg called a saddle under your buttocks, not as mercy, but to prevent you from dying too quickly from exhaustion. They wanted spectators to watch you suffer for as long as possible. Historical accounts describe victims screaming, begging, cursing, and eventually falling silent as delirium set in. Some bit their own tongues off trying to cope with the pain. Others went insane before they died, babbling incoherently as their brains became starved of oxygen. When Romans finally wanted to end it, they'd break your legs with iron clubs. Called the Crucifixion, this wasn't mercy either. It was just removing your ability to push up and breathe. From that point, you had maybe 15 minutes before asphyxiation finished what hours or days of torture had started. Picture watching this happen to another human being, knowing it could be you next if you stepped out of line. That was the point. Every labored breath, every scream of agony, every moment of visible suffering was Roman propaganda written in human flesh and blood. The nails and the suffocation were just the beginning. What made crucifixion truly devastating wasn't just the physical pain, it was the calculated psychological destruction that began long before the victim took their final breath. Picture this. You're stripped completely naked in front of a jeering crowd, not just undressed, but deliberately exposed as a final humiliation. Roman executioners didn't accidentally forget to provide clothes. This was intentional theater designed to strip away every shred of human dignity before death even arrived. In a culture where public nudity was deeply shameful, this exposure wasn't just embarrassing. It was psychologically annihilating. But here's where it gets truly insane. The mental torture was carefully orchestrated to maximize suffering. You're hanging there, completely helpless, while crowds gather below to mock your agony. Children pointed and laughed. Adults hurled insults and debris. Street vendors literally sold food to spectators who treated your dying moments like entertainment. Imagine being so powerless that your final hours become someone else's afternoon amusement. The positioning itself was psychological warfare. Crucifixion victims were typically hung at eye level, forcing direct contact with every passerby. You couldn't hide your face. Couldn't turn away from the staring eyes, couldn't escape the constant stream of mockery and revulsion from people who once knew you as a human being. Roman records describe how victims would desperately try to speak, to maintain some connection to their humanity, only to have their words met with laughter or complete indifference. Wait, it gets worse. The cross wasn't just an execution device, it was a message board. Romans often attached signs detailing your crimes, turning your dying body into a public announcement of your failures. Your final moments became a permanent advertisement of your shame, visible to every person who walked that road for days to come. Here's something that will haunt your dreams. Many victims remained conscious and aware for hours, sometimes days. This wasn't a quick death that ended suffering. You had time to fully process what was happening to you. Time to contemplate every choice that led to this moment. Time to experience the complete abandonment as friends and family either fled in terror or stood by helplessly watching your destruction. The psychological impact extended beyond the dying. Roman executioners deliberately chose the busiest roads, the most populated areas for crucifixions. This wasn't about efficient disposal of criminals. This was about traumatizing entire communities. Parents couldn't shield their children from the sight. Travelers couldn't choose alternate routes. Everyone was forced to witness the state's power to reduce human beings to suffering spectacles. But here's the truly horrifying part: the isolation. Pain medication didn't exist. Psychological counseling wasn't available. Religious comfort was often denied. You faced the most traumatic experience imaginable completely alone, while surrounded by people who viewed your agony as either entertainment or a warning to behave. The mental anguish intensified as delirium set in. Historical accounts describe victims talking to hallucinations, pleading with imaginary figures, or simply screaming incoherently as their minds broke under the combined weight of physical pain and psychological terror. The human psyche simply wasn't designed to process this level of trauma while remaining conscious. Roman writers like Seneca documented how crucifixion victims often begged for death long before their bodies gave out. The psychological torture became so unbearable that physical death felt like mercy. This wasn't just execution, it was the systematic destruction of human dignity, designed to break the spirit long before the body finally surrendered. What Romans perfected wasn't just a method of killing, it was the art of psychological annihilation performed in front of an audience who couldn't look away. The Romans didn't crucify everyone the same way. While most victims endured the standard horror of nails through wrists and feet, some faced variations that made an already unthinkable death even worse. Let's start with the most famous crucifixion victim who wasn't actually Roman at all. When the Persians conquered Babylon in 519 BC, King Darius I ordered 3,000 Babylonian nobles crucified simultaneously. But here's where it gets truly horrifying. Persian crucifixion involved impalement. Victims were literally pierced through their torso with a massive wooden stake, then hoisted upright. Death came faster than Roman methods, but the agony was exponentially worse. The Romans themselves perfected regional variations depending on the victim's crime and social status. In Judea, where crucifixion was used to terrorize Jewish rebels, victims were sometimes crucified upside down. Roman historian Josephus describes how soldiers nailed those they caught in different postures to the crosses by way of jest. We're talking about human beings treated as entertainment props by their executioners. But wait, it gets worse. During the Spartacus rebellion in 71 BCE, Marcus Licinius Crassus lined the Appian Way from Capua to Rome, with 6,000 crucified slaves. Picture this, 120 miles of road, with a dying human being nailed to a cross every few hundred yards. Travelers walking from one city to another past rotting corpses for the entire journey. Some victims hung there for weeks, their bodies becoming feeding stations for crows and vultures. The most psychologically brutal variation involved the cedul, a small wooden peg attached to the vertical beam. Here's something that will haunt your dreams. This wasn't mercy. The cedul partially supported the victim's weight, which sounds humane until you realize it was designed to prolong suffering. Instead of dying from asphyxiation in hours, victims could linger for days, forced to repeatedly lift themselves up and down as their muscles gave out. Regional variations across the empire reveal just how creative human cruelty could become. In Germania, Roman soldiers sometimes crucified victims against living trees, letting branches grow through their bodies over time. In North Africa, crosses were built lower to the ground so wild animals could reach the victim's feet and legs while they still lived. The Jewish-Roman wars produced particularly horrific innovations. Josephus records that during the siege of Jerusalem, Roman soldiers crucified Jewish refugees in different postures for sport. Some were nailed through their eyes. Others had their hands crushed with hammers before being nailed. The goal wasn't just execution, it was psychological warfare against everyone watching from the city walls. Even the nails weren't standardized. Archaeological evidence from Givat HaMivtar reveals a heel bone still pierced by an iron nail with traces of olive wood. But other sites show evidence of rope bindings, bronze spikes, and in some cases, victims who were simply tied to crosses and left to die of exposure and starvation over weeks. The most disturbing variation involved mass crucifixions as public festivals. In some provinces, executions were timed to coincide with religious holidays or market days, ensuring maximum attendance. Vendors sold food and wine to spectators who made day-long entertainment out of watching human beings die in agony. Roman records show that crucifixion methods were sometimes chosen specifically to match the victim's crime. Thieves had their hands crushed before nailing. Those convicted of sexual crimes faced public castration before crucifixion. Military deserters were sometimes crucified wearing their armor, adding weight that accelerated their suffering. This wasn't just about killing people. It was about destroying them so completely that even their deaths became warnings carved into the collective memory of everyone who witnessed them. The Roman Empire didn't just execute people. They turned death into theater. Every crucifixion was a carefully orchestrated performance designed to send one crystal-clear message. This is what happens when you mess with Rome. Picture this. You're walking along any major Roman road, and there they are. Rows of crosses stretching into the distance, each one displaying what's left of someone who dared to rebel, steal, or challenge imperial authority. The Romans didn't hide their executions in dark dungeons or private courtyards. They planted them right where everyone would see them, at city gates, along busy highways, in public squares. These weren't just execution sites. They were Rome's billboards of terror. The genius of Roman crucifixion wasn't just its brutality, it was its psychology. When Spartacus led his slave rebellion in 73 BC, the Romans didn't just defeat him. They crucified 6,000 of his followers along the Appian Way, creating a 120-mile corridor of rotting corpses that stretched from Rome to Capua. Imagine traveling that road, seeing body after body hanging there for weeks, the smell hitting you miles before you reached the next town. That's exactly what Rome wanted. They weren't just killing rebels, they were programming terror into every person who witnessed it. But here's where it gets truly calculated. The Romans reserved crucifixion specifically for slaves, foreigners, and political insurgents. Roman citizens, no matter how heinous their crimes, were spared this particular horror. This wasn't accidental, it was social engineering. Crucifixion became the ultimate symbol of your place in the Roman hierarchy. If you could be crucified, you were nobody. If you couldn't, you belonged to the master race. The psychological impact rippled through every level of society. Parents would point to those crosses and tell their children, "This is what happens to those who don't know their place." Slaves working in Roman households lived with the constant visual reminder of their disposable status. Foreign populations under Roman rule got the message loud and clear. Rebellion equals public agony. What the Romans never anticipated was how one particular crucifixion would completely flip their narrative. When Jesus of Nazareth died on a Roman cross around 30 AD, it should have been just another forgotten execution. Instead, it became the foundation of a religion that would eventually consume the very empire that killed him. The early Christians took Rome's ultimate symbol of shame and transformed it into their badge of honor. They wore crosses, painted them on walls, and turned the empire's tool of terror into a symbol of salvation. The irony is staggering. Rome designed crucifixion to demonstrate the absolute power of the state, to show that challenging imperial authority would result in the most humiliating death possible. But by crucifying Jesus, they accidentally created the most powerful symbol in human history, one that would outlast their empire by 2 millennia. Even today, that brutal Roman execution method shapes how billions of people understand concepts of sacrifice, redemption, and divine love. Churches around the world display the cross as their central symbol, completely divorced from its original meaning as an instrument of state terror. The Romans meant to create fear. Instead, they created faith. The cultural reversal was so complete that by the time Constantine converted to Christianity in the 4th century, the empire that perfected crucifixion officially banned it. The symbol of Roman supremacy became the symbol of Roman transformation. Sometimes the most powerful empires plant the seeds of their own obsolescence without even realizing it. The Romans didn't just execute criminals. They orchestrated a theater of human suffering so methodical, so deliberately agonizing that 2,000 years later, we still use the word excruciating to describe unbearable pain. That word comes directly from the Latin crucifigere, to crucify. Think about that for a moment. An entire civilization's method of execution was so horrifically effective that it literally shaped how we describe agony itself. But here's what makes Roman crucifixion truly stand out in the long, dark history of human cruelty. It wasn't designed to kill quickly. Every other execution method throughout history aimed for efficiency. The guillotine, the hangman's noose, even burning at the stake. They were meant to end a life. Crucifixion was meant to destroy it slowly, publicly, and with maximum humiliation. We're talking about an execution method where the dying process was the entire point. The Romans turned death into performance art, and the cross was their stage. They positioned crucifixions along major roads not by accident, but by design. Every traveler, every merchant, every citizen walking past would see exactly what happened to those who opposed Rome. The message wasn't subtle. It was written in broken bones and torn flesh for everyone to read. What's truly chilling is how the Romans perfected this horror through centuries of practice. They studied human anatomy to understand exactly how to maximize suffering. They knew which positions would cause the most pain, which methods would prolong, which psychological torments would break a person's spirit before their body gave out. This wasn't random brutality. It was engineered torture designed by the most advanced civilization of its time. And the scale was massive. We're not talking about occasional executions of major criminals. After Spartacus's rebellion, 6,000 crucified slaves lined the road from Rome to Capua for 120 miles. Imagine driving that distance today and seeing nothing but crucified bodies the entire way. That's the level of systematic brutality the Romans deployed as standard operating procedure. The psychological impact reached far beyond the victims themselves. Parents would drag their children past crucifixions to show them what happened to those who defied authority. Slaves would work in fields within sight of rotting corpses still hanging from crosses. The smell of death became part of daily life in the Roman world, a constant reminder that your life existed entirely at the pleasure of the state. Modern historians estimate that hundreds of thousands, possibly millions, died by crucifixion during the height of Roman power. Each death represented not just a single moment of execution, but days of public agony witnessed by entire communities. The collective trauma inflicted by this practice shaped the psychological landscape of the ancient world. Even today, sanitized depictions of crucifixion in art and film barely scratch the surface of the historical reality. The clean wounds, the noble suffering, the quick death, none of that reflects what actually happened on Roman crosses. The real thing was so brutal that even the Romans themselves, who regularly watched gladiators tear each other apart for entertainment, found crucifixions disturbing. That's the true legacy of Roman crucifixion. It wasn't just capital punishment, it was psychological warfare waged against entire populations. It was systematic dehumanization elevated to state policy, and it was so effective, so thoroughly horrifying, that it fundamentally altered human civilization's relationship with power, suffering, and death itself. When we try to imagine the absolute worst that humans can inflict on other humans, we still think about crosses,